Thank you for joining us tonight for our fourth Let's Talk About Hanford conversation. And this time we are focusing on Hanford History Part 2. I'm Ginger Wireman. I'm a Community Outreach and Environmental Education Specialist with the Washington State Department of Ecology's Nuclear Waste Program here in Richland. We want to acknowledge that we are on the ceded territories of the Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla people, and also the Wanapum people, who are not a treaty tribe, use this area heavily before Anglo history. And our guest speaker this evening is Robert Redder, and he was our guest speaker for part 1. So you can go back and find that on our agency YouTube channel. Robert, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Ginger. As Ginger said, my name is Robert Franklin. I am a assistant professor of history at Washington State University Tri-Cities, and I am also the assistant director of the Hanford History Project, which is a DOE-funded project to curate, collect, and care for the physical history of the Hanford Site, and that's located at WSU Tri-Cities as well.
Thank you. And also with us tonight is my colleague, Ryan Miller. Ryan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us again for our fourth Let's Talk About Hanford conversation. Excited to have Robert back and to cover, the second half of Hanford's history. So kind of how tonight's going to work, just like our previous events we've held, is we're going to start off with a presentation by Robert about Hanford history from the end of the World War II through the Cold War. And then we'll move into a live Q&A session with those who are attending. So you guys who are all watching, if you're on the WebEx live stream, you can input any questions you have at any time into the chat box, and we will ask them live once we're in the Q&A session. And if you're on Facebook, on the Facebook live stream, same thing. You just got to put it into the chat as soon as you, if you have any questions or any comments, we welcome any comments and feedback you have as well. So with that being said, just a reminder that this event is specifically about Hanford history from World War II through the Cold War, and we ask that if you have any questions that are off topic or for another topic, such as specifically Hanford cleanup or any other kind of Hanford related topic, that we ask that you send those to our email at hanford@ecy.wa.gov, or you just hold them for a future event that we hold that's more relevant, because Robert, his area of expertise is Hanford history, and so he won't be able to answer other questions that you have tonight. So with that being said, we'll have our awesome colleague Dana go ahead and pull up the slides, and we can move into the presentation part of the night.
And I am getting over a vicious head cold, not COVID. Feel like we all have to say that now. So if my throat's a little hoarse or I'm coughing a bit, I've had this thing for about 2 weeks and it is very stubborn. So my apologies in advance if I turn into kind of a coarse frog sounding human being. Okay. All right. So this slide here, if we can leave it just for a second, has my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out to me, as Ryan and Ginger did mention, it is part 2. So the first part covered the pre-Manhattan Project history, as well as most of World War II of Hanford's history. And so if you have any questions about that or want to learn more, please feel free to contact me. My email and my phone number are both down here on this slide. We'll be covering the end of World War II through the end of the Cold War on this presentation. We can go to the next one. So, if anyone's been around Hanford history for a bit, this is probably a pretty familiar image to you. This is the brochure from the first Atomic Frontier Days, a new celebration that Richland put on in 1948. Its earliest form was Richland Days, 1945, 46, and 47, and they rebranded it Atomic Frontier Days with this very iconic cover. And as you can see, Richland here is really reveling in its atomic heritage and its location in the arid West, and those two things are really coming together here with our atom symbol kind of lighting up the West, literally above this evoking this pioneer imagery, and then of course kind of moving away, shining light on the industrialization of this era, and that's it, this is really doing a lot of things here. One, it's I mean, we can look at what it's not saying about, or kind of how it's talking about people without addressing them. Clearly, by evoking this imagery, we're evoking that this land was seen as originally being empty, and we know that's not the case. It's the land of several tribes and treaty groups that, as Diana mentioned, for thousands of years, um, this land has been their home. And but Wild West imagery often evokes empty open lands, where Native Americans are either kind of in the way of progress, or as obstacles to be removed. And so this Western imagery evokes that as well. It kind of draws on this myth making of the American West and how it exists more in myth than in reality. And Hanford workers are clearly telegraphing to us that they see themselves. Hanford workers and the Atomic Energy Commission are clearly telegraphing that they see themselves as this kind of second pioneering generation. They're drawing on the frontier thesis, and the new post-war dominance of the United States to make their claim that they are pioneers and frontiers of this new science, um, that to them is going to be this narrative of kind of like redemption and hard work that they've been told or they've agreed to, but one that historians have spent no small amount of effort poking holes in, because simply the narrative of how the Wild West is portrayed in myth and in media is not reflective of the actual place. Uh, but of course, that is not how people saw it here. And so I love this cover. And this cover adorns a very excellent book called Atomic Frontier Days by Bruce Heavley and John Finley, a great book to read if you're curious about Hanford. And this really does the most. This one single image to me does the most about Hanford in the early Cold War. If I can go to the next slide. Wasn't the only Atomic Frontier Days, as you can see on the left. There was a second Atomic Frontier Days with a brochure. The hard hats and assault masks in the Northwest Desert, they're clearing this atomic wilderness on this, our last frontier, is what that cover says. This is the following year, and this is also a pretty powerful image, right, of nuclear workers, of kind of shocking imagery of a gas mask, in front of Rattlesnake Mountain, Rlaylik. Um, really transposing the kind of wild open imagery with the the industrial production of plutonium that's going on in this place. Um, and it really runs for a decade. The Atomic Frontier Days runs for about a decade, kind of celebrating this at this time, very short but very triumphalist history of the Hanford Site. And Richland at this time in the late 40s and early 50s is really very typical of any boom town in the Wild West, where it is, it's a company town. But the company is the government. The government owns housing and everything, and they produce a product, and that product is plutonium. It's a magnet for young workers, lots of men, some skilled, um, but some unskilled, drawn by these well-paying jobs. And as you can see, they do on the right what young men do. They're proud of clearly they took time to take this photo of all of their empty beer cans. They're working hard and they're playing hard here, um, making this plutonium. If we can go to the next slide, please. While not unique to Hanford at all, it's important to look at how gender intersects with the Atomic West, in the workplace, both in selling safety, like here on the left, and recognizing the allowed roles of women, like on the upper right, which that sign says without them it wouldn't have been possible. And of course, them is referring to the secretary girls on that float. That's a 1946 float. Um, but also to the sexualization of women in the West, and the kind of the uncomfortable tension between the sexualization of young girls and these kind of post-war American beauty standards, with also this image of Richland as very family friendly, and this kind of like all American town socialist utopia that it really was. Why would I call it a socialist utopia? Well, it was a town of 100% employment, and the employer was the government, and everyone who lived there had a job, and was beholden of their job to the government. And in that way, it is the kind of purest form of socialist utopia. Um, uh, it exists in a capitalist system, but certainly it is socialism, and Richland and Hanford offers this way to see how women's work in one way is being recognized, but primarily though their bodies are being used to sell to sell workplace fire prevention safety, and that it's clearly telegraphed that women have a limited amount of roles at this time, as we know throughout the country, throughout the society, and clearly that's telegraphed here. Can we go to the next slide? And I mean, what more do I need to say? With something like keep your mind on your work, not the wiggle, right? This very idea that women in the workplace would serve as an industrial hazard, when Hanford is a place of many industrial hazards, many of them purposely designed, i.e. the production of plutonium is in itself dangerous. The close tolerances and the general radioactivity and industrial chemicals, hazardous chemicals that are a part of that, not even going into workplace hazards like asbestos and other things, but clearly you know giving this idea that women in the workplace are another hazard, and one that is perhaps being tolerated is the nicest thing that we can say about this. um, uh, this picture always makes me think of this old Jimmy Stewart movie where he tells a woman that she has an attractive jiggle, um, and which it's just very emblematic of the time, right? This is very reductionist, and it doesn't surprise us again, but it does, you know, it does, it does tell us a lot about the workplace and the people that made this product and the type of community that it was. Okay, next slide, please. Hanford has a complicated relationship with the thousands of African Americans who came north to build the reactors, to build the sidewalks, to do the hard construction labor to create this place, and who not only came during World War II, but stayed in East Pasco, or may have left for other war work, but came back for the expansion of Hanford and the Cold War to help build the dams. Hanford is thus part of this larger story of Great Migration, the largest migration effort in North America, in all of American history, is the Great Migration, the 6 decade long exodus of millions of African Americans from the southern United States to all points north, east, and west. Arriving African Americans to Pasco, Tri-Cities found jobs and generally equal pay, because it was defense contract work, and New Deal legislation signed by President Roosevelt, President FDR, had mandated that there be equal pay for equal work. But they also found segregation. They also found job discrimination, in that they were kept out of skilled or union work. They were equal pay for laboring work, but were kept out of skilled positions, technical positions, and the likes. And they were forced to live in the East Pasco ghetto, an area which really until the mid-1960s had no streetlights, no real sewer system to speak of, no paved streets, and many often lived in dilapidated automobile trailers or in wood shacks. One thing that really galls me about this era, and researching the conditions in East Pasco, is a lot of effort in the Hanford story and the Richland story is put forward in these alphabet houses, and these alphabet houses are memorialized in any number of ways, and and for people that are proud of the alphabet houses, I understand they're this, you know, interesting piece of construction. They remind me a lot of a military base and kind of the uniform housing there in suburbia, and I kind of shy away from that thing personally, but I understand how important they are to Richland. However, alpha, the alphabet houses provide us an excellent comparison to how thousands of African Americans lived in Pasco. And because keep in mind, by 1950, over 2,000 African Americans lived in Pasco. It was about 20% of the city was African American, and that made it per capita the highest amount of African Americans per capita in the Pacific Northwest. And what's even more interesting is Pasco is predominantly rural. It's one of the few places in the West, rural areas that African Americans migrated to. Anyway, back to the alphabet houses. These were brand new, high quality housing built for almost exclusively white workers and their families. African Americans who lived in East Pasco, who lived in dilapidated automobile trailers or wood shacks, or sometimes even housing they had to construct themselves out of spare materials, housing that had no running water in it, people cooking over wood stoves until the 1960s. African Americans paid roughly double the amount of rent for this dilapidated housing than white workers in Richland paid for their alphabet houses, proving the axiom that it is expensive, it's often more expensive to be poor, and that slumlords or slum-like situations take advantage of poor people because you end up paying more for less. And so African Americans worked hard and paid to live in East Pasco, more to live in East Pasco in less housing with little running water or electricity. Um, just shocking to me at the two different stories that these tell about these two communities and the haves and have-nots. In addition, entertainment like minstrel shows, as here on the right, were common occurrences in Richland during the 1940s and 1950s. In fact, I just digitized and unearthed some footage from the late 1940s of an actual minstrel show taking place at the North Richland construction camp. Um, Meanwhile, you know, thousands of African Americans are laboring in the area. Um, Yet minstrelsy has a long, complicated history in the United States, but you know, clearly the presence of black bodies were wanted for their labor, but not for their actual presence, because they were relegated whenever they could be by city planners, by General Electric and DuPont. They were literally relegated to the other side of the tracks or put in their place, reflecting a larger concerted American effort to segregate African Americans. Next slide, please. This Christmas calendar from 1944 displays the literal segregation forced on African Americans at the Hanford construction camp. That so-called colored peoples had separate entertainment schedules, and of course they lived in separate mess halls, separate barracks, but literally even the entertainment was segregated. Next slide, please. So black and white civil rights workers fought tirelessly in the 1950s and 1960s to desegregate Kennewick, Richland, and Hanford and Pasco, making gains over time in employment, education, and housing, um, largely built off of or working in concert with larger civil rights struggles, taking advantage of civil rights legislation. And in this way, because Hanford was um, part of the federal government or funded by the government, affirmative action type legislation was able to take effect at Hanford early on because the government could force the private contractors to use affirmative action in hiring long before other private businesses would be forced into that. And same with schools. Schools are often an easy target because they receive federal funding. Um, but of course, this was a concerted effort of African Americans and white civil rights allies through organizations like the NAACP, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. There's even a small local unit of the Black Panthers in Pasco for a couple of years before that institution closed down. Okay, and I will say that of course equity still remains elusive for peoples of color in the Tri-Cities, um, especially when you look at where people in the Tri-Cities live, and the neighborhoods and schools and funding for those types of things are still kind of coded in this racial landscape, especially when you hear people talk about places like East Pasco, even still today. Next slide. Also in the Cold War, immense anxiety over impending nuclear destruction. Duck and cover literally is the literal representation of this ever-present fear of nuclear annihilation. Come home, which I can only imagine is terrifying moments for these school children. You talk to people that went through this, I think a lot of them thought it was a game, but I can't imagine everyone did. I would imagine that some of this has to have been terrifying. This thought, when one lingers too long on what this symbolizes. Most Richland residents who I've interviewed chose not to reflect on these moments of the Cold War, rather emphasizing that they felt safe and untouched by the war, and that may have been a psychological survival strategy. Next slide, please. So these next 9 slides are all from this radiation safety primer that are in the Hanford History Project collections, put out by the Atomic Energy Commission and given to employees of the Hanford sites and other nuclear weapons complexes, I presume. But I've only found this copy. I've only seen this ever online or in our archive. As we go through it, notice how paternalistic it is and how it presents radiation as an easily controllable force, and actually flips the safety on the hands of the employees. It's passing the responsibility for safety to the employee. That this place is by default safe, and that only the employee can make the area unsafe. So we'll just go through. We'll go to the next slide. So first, employees who obey rules can work a lifetime safely in this plant. Next slide. Radiation hazards are measured with special instruments. Next slide. Engineers check dust, exhaust hoods, and other dust control equipment to reduce dust exposure. Well, those of if you pay attention to cleanup, you know how much stuff is in dust hoods, like in the plutonium finishing plant and the plutonium reclamation facility and others. These ended up being very much problem areas and may not have been subject to the strict safeguards, or the danger may not have been as well communicated or well understood as it is communicated here. Next slide. You will receive a medical examination at regular intervals. Well, that should make us all feel better. Next slide. The radiation you received is measured by film badges or dosimeters. Records are carefully kept on each employee. Not telling you what they're going to do with the records or if you'll be notified, but they are keeping track of what you get. Next slide. Where the type of radiation hazard requires, all work clothes are provided and washed by the plant. Isn't that great? One of the people I interviewed, a friend of mine, is actually used to run the laundry out in the 200 area, and sometimes they would get appreciable levels of plutonium in the water. They had to have a special process to treat wastewater and try to extract some of those radionuclides out, because of fears that they could be fizzle. Nothing ever went fizzle in there, of course, but this is very. I think we think of laundry as a rather domestic and mundane job, but clearly at Hanford it has special protocols, shall we say, that affect that make it a bit more complex. Next slide, please. This is my favorite. You are the keystone of your safety. You must cooperate. This is the ultimate putting the onus on the employee. I almost read this as threatening, or you know, it may be more trying to instill the responsibility on the employee, but man, oh man, it sure is making it personal. Next slide. Is it safe to work here? The answer is up to you. Well, the answer is also up to the nature of the work and the ability to monitor the work, and the questions of whether we should do the work at all, and what are the long-term costs of doing the work, and is the safety of that work up to the people. This this was clearly meant to be given out to people that were and the cartoonishness of it, is clearly meant to be given out to people who may have not had high education levels or extensive reading comprehension. I think it's designed to mollify, to pacify, to kind of to regiment people into line, um, and it does a good job of that, I think. This radiation primer, while really downplaying the culpability of the people's ordering the work, or the very nature of the work itself. Next slide, please. So by 1964, when this photo is taken, Hanford is operating 9 reactors. The original 3, B, D, and F, along with the C reactor, the DR, the K East, K West, H reactor, and N, the new production reactor. By 1964, the U.S. is approaching just a glut of plutonium, and all but one reactor and the dual-purpose new reactor are going to be shut down by 1968, scheduled for shutdown. Hanford is also using a new process for chemical separations at this time, and this will be its 3rd process of chemical separations. And the complexity and the amount of waste has grown rapidly from World War II to this period. And in many ways, Hanford has been the guinea pig for these different kinds of plutonium processing. And all this experimentation leaves Hanford with a legacy of very complex, dangerous, complicated waste products, where it's not just one waste stream, but multiple. Next slide. This is just a slide for levity because we've talked a lot about mutual destruction and all sorts of things. And as a kid, I always really loved The Simpsons and always marveled at how Homer could have a job in a nuclear plant. And a lot of what The Simpsons portrays, Homer's supposed to work in a power plant, but he's doing things that one would do in a nuclear production plant, which confuses me to this day and causes me a little grief. But I always loved this episode with the rod. And then when I found these pictures on the left, of these fuel rods for N reactor, and especially this wonderful young lady kind of doing this posing shot with the fuel rod. I just had to put these. I put these two things together in my strange brain, and I wanted to leave this for you as something else to put together in our strange brain. And another thing, while The Simpsons may not depict life in a power plant well, because Homer does a lot of things that aren't power plant related, a lot of nuclear reactor operators I know only do have a high school education. That's all that one needed in the 60s or 70s to get in at the ground floor at the N reactor. And everyone that worked in the reactor was a nuclear operator. Kind of a misleading title. I think we think that's all people in the control room, like pulling, levers and like reading dials, and really it's almost anyone if you're involved in charge, discharge, anything like that. But yeah, high school education could get you a lifetime of security and a pretty decent dose rate. Next slide, please. So, despite a restart in the early 1980s, what's known as the Reagan restart, or the restarting of N and Purex and PFP, by the late 1980s, with the ending of the Cold War, Hanford is eyed for permanent shutdown by its many, many opponents. Opposition to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, as opponents of nuclear weapons begin to tie those two issues together. Organizations like the National Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, etc. Opponents of Hanford and all things nuclear grew in the wake of accidents and disasters and public relations disasters like the 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania and Chernobyl, of course, in the Ukraine. In addition, investigative journalists from the Spokesman Review and others have pressured DOE to release a trove of Hanford reports from World War II on, and buried in these technical documents are revelations of unintentional and intentional releases of radiation, which began to spur downwinder litigation and this recognition of the downwind population. And of course, the biggest intentional release that's revealed in these documents is the 1949 Green Run, an intentional release of iodine-131 1 and other radionuclides into the atmosphere. As I mentioned in my last presentation, that intentional release is nothing compared to the unintentional releases of the World War II years, where processing of green fuel was commonplace. But I think it's the intentional nature and the usage of the plant as part of an effort to surveil what it might look like when the Soviets are doing the thing, that intentionally putting people in danger versus the unintentionally doing it is the main opposition point. People don't want to be unwitting test subjects. This is why we have institutional review boards and informed consent and all of that kind of thing. Many of these downwinder cases take years or decades to settle, if they settle at all, and require costly and pretty imprecise dose reconstruction projects. Pictured here are members of the Hanford family, a pro-Hanford group, who went to Olympia in 1987 to try to stop the decommissioning of Hanford. I've been very interested since finding this stuff in our collections. I've been very interested in this kind of grassroots conservative protest. I think we think of a lot of grassroots protest as being countercultural. We think about the environmental movement, the early anti-nuclear movement, many movements in the 60s and 70s. And this is one instance of kind of a conservative faction taking on the same tactics to save Hanford and amplify how proud of Hanford they are. It's a very interesting movement that ultimately, of course, came to no end. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in the last slide, beginning in the late 1980s, different groups began to press for Hanford cleanup, including the Hanford Challenge, pictured here. After the signing of the tri-party agreement between the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the Washington State Department of Health, the Tri-Cities community reluctantly began to embrace cleanup of the Hanford site. And it became, and well touted, the largest EPA Superfund site in the United States. The Department of Energy currently spends more on cleanup each year than it did to ever make plutonium in any given year. And in that way, the Hanford family or the people trying to save Hanford jobs were more than successful. They had to paint Hanford as a deeply contaminated and troubled place to get the money to flow, but the money, like the spice, does flow. Some of the cleanup approach in the surrounding politics of cleanup are deserve its own lecture because it is complex and somewhat nonsensical. Next slide, please. There's other elements of this era as well. In the 1990s, groups like the Reactor Museum Association, which I am the current president of, formed to pressure the Department of Energy to save the B reactor as a museum or interpretive site, to force the Department of Energy to recognize the historical impact that the B reactor had in all of its many forms. It's good and bad. It's technological and it's moral, as a site of technological achievement and contributing to loss of life and the deeply unsettling nature of mutually assured destruction. Love it or hate it, it's clearly an important place of history, being the world's first full-scale nuclear production reactor and a site to have pretty important conversations. In addition, the artist, the nuclear sculptor, Jim Acorn, moved to Richland and becomes really enchanted with the power of the fast flux test facility to transmute metals and wants to make art by transmuting different metals inside the reactor. And he wants to explore the myriad of complexities, contradictions, and moral quandaries around the Hanford site. And this is probably why I like him so much, and I put him in this presentation. Jim was never able to make his art in the fast flux test facility, or make art out of spent breeder reactor fuel assemblies. The DOE, understandably and not understandably, was not too keen on letting loose this Seattle sculptor on Hanford, but nevertheless, his life and his mission at Hanford to kind of both to use art to forge conversations about nuclear science and the impact of nuclear science and nuclear weapons admirable. And he's a subject of my future studies and research. But also the DOE realized that in the 90s that it has to comply with historic preservation law and forms the Hanford collection, this artifact and archive collection that I currently help to manage and participate in an active collection as part of the Hanford History Project. The saving of Hanford's physical, literal history in order to tell the myriad of Hanford stories moving forward. Next slide, please. And of course, the DOE spends $2 billion a year, but who's counting? It's hard not to be cynical about Hanford cleanup when you look at it historically and you live it and you are immersed in the discussions surrounding it. Next slide, please. The Reactor Museum Association and others were ultimately successful in their aims to preserve the reactor. It is now part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park and is also a National Historic Landmark and open for tours, hopefully when COVID ends. Okay, last slide. So, in my previous presentation, I talked about animal experiments and the biology department headed by Herb Parker and Walter Koenig. Well, this photo is a photo of one of the plutonium pigs that underwent plutonium skin contamination studies, picked because, not because pigs have similar skin to humans, but because many biologists had good experiences working with pigs in study, and so that's why they picked pigs. Same with beagles. That's actually why most research animals are picked. It's not because the data ports well from animal to person. It's generally because of personal bias in the form of researchers. And this crude photoshopping of this poor pig who would have been contaminated with plutonium or had plutonium inserted inside their organs and a glass viewing porthole surgically put into them so that people could view the organs. This is very macabre, I know. It's pretty disturbing. But this photoshopping was done by the sick, morbid people of the Hanford Biology Department in the 1950s themselves to represent Elmer Fudd. And they are a macabre bunch with a very morbid sense of humor. And so but it's a perfect slide, or it's a perfect segue to the question and answer period, I think, as well as summing up the presentation. I mean, you can't really do any better than that. Please do. If you have any questions, here's my contact information. Also, our digital collections are up on the website at hanfordhistory.com. We have photos, oral histories, reminiscences. More things go up every day. More photos and oral histories go up. I have interns working hard, getting more material up on there. So if you're interested in those Hanford primary sources, or just you're looking for more resources on Hanford, books and articles and so on about the history of Hanford, please check out our website.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Robert. That was, as always, really informative, and I know I learned a whole bunch of new information about Hanford that I didn't know before. So we don't have any questions that have come in yet. So as of now, we'll just ask anybody that has a question to please put them in the chat on WebEx or the chat on Facebook. But with that, we do have a couple pre-submitted questions we can start off with to kind of kick things off while people are putting their questions in. I know the Facebook stream is also like 30 seconds behind, so they might take a little bit to get some questions in. So Robert, this is a bit of a fun one. I've heard that there have been UFO sightings over the site. What is the history on that?
There's actually a great article that came out a couple months ago about that. Any way we can link that?
Absolutely, I can put that in the chat.
But yes, there were some UFO stands for unidentified flying objects. So if you don't know what it is and it's flying, it's a UFO. Whether the UFOs are aliens is a totally separate question. Yes, there were one of the most impactful then unidentified flying objects, now identified, there was a Japanese balloon bomb that hit the Hanford site in the late 1944. The Japanese set off a bunch of tens of thousands of these balloon bombs, and these were pretty interesting devices, these large helium balloons with a series of weights and tied to an altimeter, and they sent them off, and they were supposed to float over the jet stream across the Pacific, land in North America, and cause general chaos. They lost just a bunch of them to wind and weather and all that, but some of them did make landfall. One killed a family in Bly, Oregon. But another one hit a power line at Hanford and briefly shut off power to the B reactor and actually forced it to shut down for a period of time. So in that way, the Japanese did attack the B reactor and they did force a brief shutdown. Colonel Matthias also and others reported seeing like strange lights over the Hanford site at times. And so there were these kind of interesting reports, but nothing. They found out what the balloon bombs were, and then for the lights, no one ever quite figured it out. There's just noted in his diary, and but no other UFO sightings I know of past World War II.
It's pretty funny that they thought they'd get this far and that some of them did. So I have one of the questions is when the alphabet houses were released to the public for sale, which would have been around 1958, I believe, were they offered first to the residents who were existing in the house, or were they put on a list or something?
It's a good question. Yeah, so for, the alphabet houses, which were built by the government, owned by the government, and managed by the contractors, first DuPont and then General Electric, were government property, and people rented them, and you could rent them furnished, you could rent them unfurnished. Richland decided to incorporate or privatize in 1958, and the government, I think, wanted out of the landlord business. They offered the houses first to the people that lived in them. And if it was a duplex, whoever had lived in the duplex longest had the opportunity to buy the whole duplex. And then if they didn't want it, the other family had the opportunity to buy the duplex. And then they went out on the open market. So yeah, the people living in them had the opportunity to buy them. We've got some correspondence from Jim Mattis's mother, actually, whose first name I forget, but I know she's Jim Mattis's mother because we've scanned and sent him these letters that we found in our collection, where she was bitterly complaining about the price of the alphabet houses, that the government was ripping people off, basically. And a lot of people felt that way. Of course, if you look at the house prices in the Tri-Cities now, it feels like much more of a rip-off these days. Or at least housing market's crazy. But you can imagine it would have been in the late 50s as well, because there wasn't that much house construction and private development at that time. So yeah, I would. So yes, they did offer them first to the people there, and then they went on the open market.
I actually knew the answer to that because I met a woman just the other day who is living in the house she was born in, and it's down on Abbott Street, and her parents bought it. I think she said for not 15,000. That seems too high.
Yeah.
But 100 seems too low, but somehow the number 15 is in my head. Have you ever seen what the sale prices were?
I do. I'd have to look at the records to go back, but it was somewhere, depending on the type of house, it was from around like 1,800 to like 4,000 or 5,000 for the much nicer, like the L house, which was like
Right.
4 bedrooms, big house. But yeah, the government actually had to lower the prices. Not enough people were buying it first, and they had to lower them. But yeah, I mean, when you look at inflation, even from 1958 to today, clearly that was a good investment if you bought an alphabet house back then. So.
Well, thanks for that answer. So we do have some questions coming in on both WebEx and Facebook now.
It also looks like somebody has their hand raised as well.
Okay, cool. We will see who we can snag here for questions. We'll start off though with Dan Solitz from the WebEx. He just asked for some more details on dose reconstruction, please.
Oh, so yeah, this is a part that I'm fuzziest on because it doesn't exist a lot, because a lot of that activity took place outside the Hanford site through DOE used its own private contractors, and then the downwinders used their own set of people, and most of that was fought out in the courts, and some of those cases only relatively recently wrapped up. I know you can look into the history of the header, the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, HEDR, has quite a long or a lot of open publications out as well as the group Consequences on Radiation Exposure, or CORE, is just a font of information about the dose reconstruction studies. So the header, which was a DOE-funded project, and then CORE, which was basically one of the main downwinder groups. Both of those would be able to provide you with, and where I get a lot of the information that I do find. I do have a recently donated big stack of publications and things from Dade Moeller, which is now NV5. They were the company that was some of the people that worked there, and Dade Moeller was hired by the government to do part of the DOE's dose reconstruction. I just haven't had the personnel to go through those and fully process the collection, because right now it's just me at the project and my interns. Um, but hopefully we'll get to those papers in the coming years. Um, but I have to prioritize the stuff that comes from the site. And because most of my funding goes to collecting Hanford history from 43 to 90, and things that come from the site. These related things like dose reconstruction are really, really important, but they're not specifically part of my purview, although they are part of my academic interest. So it's kind of like there's that balance in there as well. I do know that the dose reconstructions were, it's a tough, I've spoken to a lot of people that participated in them. It's a very, very tough, it's a hard science. I mean, hard as in it's very imprecise. It's very tough to go back and estimate dose based on diet, because there's so many things you have to factor in: diet, releases, wind, temperature. Um, that it really satisfied nobody, I guess, maybe except for the government. It certainly didn't satisfy the downwinders, which is a shame. Um, and it's one that is there was a lot of fighting even within Header and the Mancuso study, and with a lot of the scientists that underwent that. There's a really great collection of material about the Mancuso. And that's another thing to look up. Interested in dose reconstruction and Hanford worker doses, is the Mancuso study, Mancuso study, is in Bryce Breitenstein and others that did work on that. Very important, very controversial effect on low dose, study on the effects of low dose radiation on nuclear workers. And then, of course, you could extrapolate that to surrounding communities. So another great resource.
Great, thanks for that feedback. Ginger, do you have the Facebook pulled up? Do you see any, do you want to ask one of those questions?
I don't have Facebook pulled up. I will. Hold on a second. But
Okay.
before we do that, what is the weirdest or most wacky Hanford fact you have discovered from this period?
Oh, the weirdest and most wacky Hanford fact that I know of is the 619 building. Are either of you familiar with that? The Plutonium Mine. Now, plutonium is a man-made product. So why does one build a plutonium mine? How do you mine a man-made material? Well, you mine a man-made material when you've dumped enough waste into the ground, or you've had enough leakage in your cribs, that you actually realize you've dumped enough plutonium in there that you have to account to the federal government. So sometime in the late 60s, forget which contractor, because there's just an alphabet soup of contractors, as you guys know, and I'm sure anyone that pays attention knows this is a total alphabet soup of contractors. Um, they build this mine to basically dig out this contaminated earth, and that they have to go and separate the plutonium out from, because it's in such appreciable quantities that, one, there's a concern that it's fissile, which thankfully it wasn't, but two, it's enough that the company has to be accounted, that has to account for or face very significant fines, because it's one of the most expensive things to make on earth, and so you have to go and get it. So the existence of the plutonium mine, definitely one of the strangest things. It's one of the only mines I know that was ever built to mine a man-made substance out of the ground. Um,
That is really interesting. Well, so this question comes from Susan Leckbend on Facebook, and I know you might be able to provide an answer on the historical part of this, and maybe Ginger and I could tap onto the more recent cleanup part. But Susan asks, as the site converted from weapons production to cleanup, how much impact has enhanced public engagement, including Native Americans, had on cleanup, including the Hanford Advisory Board, which is more than a quarter century old?
Yeah, so um, the rising anti-nuclear movement certainly really affected Hanford, and really the first story on the Downwinders on Tom, why can't I think of his last name? He's so prevalent. I'm fudging it. You guys know who I'm talking, Tom Bailey. The profile of Tom Bailey in the Spokesman Review, 1985, really helped crack open public accountability at Hanford, and it started like it normally does with government projects, where the DOE just, in response, dumped an immense amount of information and said, "Here, you sort it out." It's a common tactic that government agencies use to throw people off trails or to just frustrate opponents, because they just go, "Here's all the information," and so much of it is highly technical and non-pertinent to clean up or to contamination that you have to pay people to sift through all of it. But sift they did, and find out things about the Green Run, and enough was found to really cause concern and that need of oversight. Um, and I think I just want to add that I think that the tribal voice is one that is so needed in terms of talking about stewardship, responsibility to the land, to future generations. But one that, I mean, these tribal peoples were dispossessed of this land long ago, before Hanford, and Hanford has made it so that the fundamental relationship with the land is forever altered. And so there's really kind of crimes on crimes here in that way, in terms of like generational crime, or crimes of connection to self.
Great, thanks for that feedback. And Ginger, I know you've worked in ecology far longer than I have. Do you have any of your own thoughts from ecology's perspective on the impact of enhanced public engagement with Hanford cleanup?
I think I think that I feel as though without public engagement, that cleanup wouldn't be where it is. And I think from stories I've heard from other EM sites around the EM being the management of the former sites that the Department of Energy is doing cleanups on, which there are a bunch of them, not just Hanford. We have probably the most robust engagement and the most diverse stakeholder groups involved in our cleanup. And from some of the sites that have had completed cleanup, I've heard that engagement wasn't particularly thorough, and that maybe cleanup was also not particularly thorough because nobody was demanding it. So I think our pretty robust engagement is really leading us to hopefully the best outcome in the end. And of course, COVID threw everybody off track, but we are working really hard to ensure that when it's safe to do so, we'll return to good, more robust public engagement. Let's see. And I do a lot of outreach too, by the way, sorry.
I just want to throw a bone out too, and give credit to Hanford's historic resources also really play an active role in cleanup, in that they draw public attention to this place, and the work of the DOE and the Park Service in managing the Manhattan Project National Historical Park creates these sites for people to keep having these conversations and to get interested in Hanford, for its history and its cleanup. And so these are really important assets to leverage for our environmental concerns as well, because this is really a site of multiple significances. And that's what makes it so interesting as a historian.
Yeah, and I would like to remind anybody on Facebook that as soon as the public tours reopen, try to get out here, because we still have docents who worked on site, and unfortunately those people are getting old and they are not able to be docents anymore. And I've been working for ecology for 20 years. My friends and colleagues were heavily involved in getting the Reactor Museum going, and quite a few of them have passed. And so, you know, getting those stories straight from the people who lived it is you know, an opportunity that is shrinking. And I know the National Park Service is going to do an awesome job, but having those actual volunteers, if you can, I think is really, really critical.
And we do have a bunch of the stories of those people up on the website too, as part of our
Yeah, and there's also, I really like the Voices of the Manhattan Project Oral Histories. That's another really good resource. One of the questions was, how do you decide what historical artifacts are added to the Hanford collection?
That's a good question. We have a programmatic agreement that the DOE signed with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, approved by Keeper of the National Register, that lays out what buildings and themes of Hanford's history are significant, and then we go and collect on those themes. So that includes things that contribute directly to plutonium processing, or as things especially designed and modified for use at Hanford, but also social historical considerations, like things that document the lives of workers. Because Hanford is, one, this industrial place that is not unlike a lot of other industry, but two, it's also this brand new industry. And so we collect at the intersection of that. But we use the programmatic guidance to help, our document to help guide us when both different buildings, but also different themes of history. And so
Awesome.
our
Thank you.
collection is over 2,000 artifacts and over 500 linear feet of archival material.
So that kind of goes actually in line with the next question from Deanna on Facebook. And we've definitely touched on her question already in the last couple minutes. But Deanna asked, where do you find the historical pictures? And we might be able to both touch base on this one. I can start off since a little busy for a second. But when I started at college, we had a stockpile of historical photos already. And in my time here, I've just done some digging on the internet. I found a huge photo dump on Flickr. There's you know, a lot of local resources I'm sure Robert can touch on, but basically, you know, if you want to reach out directly to both Robert or Ecology, and you have any specific kind of photos that you might be looking for, we might be able to help you out. We might have a photo on standby already that you might you know, want, but I can let Robert touch on what he's found, some of the photos that he hasn't mentioned already.
Yeah, we have some in the Department of Energy's collection, and we're working on. They were digitized 20 plus years ago, and so are lower quality. So we've been working on re-digitizing them at higher quality and getting those online. In addition, we just have lots of collections from the old Crest Museum and from private individuals that we get, and when we can, we digitize them and put them online. So our photo archive on our website grows. But I have 3, 4, 5 times as many photos in the archive that are not yet digital that I have some information on. So if you're interested, and you're looking for specific photos, or photos about a building or a theme, please reach out. I'll do my best to help find you the photos that hopefully you're looking for. Because yeah, there are many, many many tens, hundreds of thousands of photos about Hanford. I did see a question in the WebEx chat here.
Yeah, you can go ahead and read that one aloud and answer it if you like.
So or Tracy, sorry if I'm butchering your name, asked, what is your favorite book about Hanford? And being a verbose historian, of course, I don't just have one favorite book about Hanford, but I'll try to keep it concise. One book I like, that I assign to students, that I really like for what it says about the community of Richland, is Plutopia by Kate Brown. This is a book that's very well regarded in academic circles, very maligned in kind of Hanford circles. And there are some things that Kate Brown doesn't quite do right, in my opinion. Her description of some of the processing and decisions that GE and the AEC made is a little harsh. Her quest to kind of like put the Russian nuclear program and the American nuclear program next to each other, and being, and kind of in their culpability of just badness, is problematic because they're not easily comparable programs. But what that book does and says about the community of Richland and these kind of atomic utopias is spot on. It's spot on. It's amazing, and she does great work on the Russian side. Arguably, the Russian part of that book is better than the U.S. part of that book, but it's very interesting comparison. I really like the book. A little problematic, but I love the book. Another great book, if you're just looking for like an easy to read book that's about Hanford, is Steve Olson wrote The Apocalypse Factory. A great book. It's a pretty big publisher, Rowan, I think. Pretty provocative title, but he uses apocalypse in the biblical term, meaning a place of great momentousness, um, not the death and destruction that we typically associate apocalypse with. And his is a book that really blends oral histories. It blends the full scope of Hanford from Eastern Washington Desert to Nagasaki through the Cold War. I find that to be a really, really excellent treatment of Hanford. Both of those books, I think, do a really great job at examining the larger picture. So I'd recommend both of those.
Great, thanks for those recommendations. I know I read Apocalypse Factory, and it was, again, another very informative resource. So our next question, this one comes, you guys see me looking to my right, that's where my other screen's at. This one comes from Damian Davis, and Damian asks, are the rumors true about water storage under the Uptown and at Chief Joe Middle School?
I don't know. I don't know. I've heard about it, never seen it. Um, that's kind of a tight-lipped one. I don't know. It's possible, but again, I don't know.
I've never heard about that, but there is a bomb shelter underground in a tunnel between Carmichael and Richland High. And they actually, when my kids were at Carmichael, they actually opened it up for a Halloween dance or something. So
I would dismiss it, but so I grew up in a small town in Alaska that was built by the government. It's Palmer, and it's the Matanuska Valley Colony. And the New Deal was built to resettle Midwestern farm families. It was a giant waste of federal funding. I mean, just a purpose. It was a project in search of a problem. Um, the town that the government built, they did build underground tunnels. One from the creamery to the administrative office underground. And it was always this thing growing up where people would talk about these underground tunnels. And Palmer's not a big town. When I was growing up, Palmer was like 2,000 people. And you'd be like, why would you ever build a tunnel? But they did. And it was to protect it in World War II, to protect against aerial war. So it's possible, because the stranger things have happened.
Awesome, thanks for the insight. This next one also comes from Facebook. This one is from Jim Thomas, and Jim asks, you referred to unintentional releases of radiation. This does not mean the releases were accidental, does it?
Uh, Good question, Jim. Um, no, I guess I'm trying to differentiate between these large releases that were done during the war years, that were part of the standard operation, and between the intentional release of the green run, right, where they knew they were processing green fuel, where they set out to do it, to pump iodine into the air, to monitor it, so then they could fly U-2s with monitoring equipment over Russia and try to monitor them as well. So this kind of unintentional, it, it was more just kind of the cost that they assumed it was the cost of doing business. They wanted to produce the plutonium as quickly as possible. They To them, they weren't processing green fuel. They were figuring out the standards of how long to let the fuel sit, when to process it, realizing, and it took a while for them to realize this, but looking at the amount of releases in late 44 and throughout most of 45 and part of 46, and saying this is way too much to put out. It's mucking up all of our radiation monitors. There's contamination all over the site. We have to do something. And also they're just letting the plutonium sit a bit longer, would have had better results, but in their rush, they processed this fuel that we now know of as we would now call green fuel. They wouldn't have called it green fuel initially. So I guess I would just say unintentional in that, it was it was not a major concern during the war, and even afterward. Really not until it's mucking up radiate, like it's mucking up their ability to monitor inside the reactors because there's so much contamination outside that it's starting to come inside, and it's also just playing havoc with anything. How do you know if you've had an accident if everything is mucked up around the tea plant?
Definitely. So I have another question on Facebook. But before that, we'll note Susan made one comment for clarification. She said, the government doesn't generate any money. Taxpayers have funded Hanford since the beginning. Thanks for the reminder there, Susan.
True.
So this next question comes from Lou Frederick on Facebook. And Lou asks, what data do we now have on the impact of the intentional and unintentional radiation releases on rural communities on the east on the river, the Hanford Reach?
That's not a question I can really answer. Um, you'd want to look at dose reconstruction. You'd want to look at the downwinder litigation, and you'd want to talk to the HAB and folks that monitor these areas to tell you about the impact um, of that. Because yeah, from a historical sense, I can talk about historical concerns about salmon, concerns about the milk iodine pathway, the monitoring of school children through the whole body counter, but the kind of cumulative impacts are best left to someone who specializes in that, or peoples that specialize in that.
Great, and I think that's a question we might be able to maybe look into more. Lou, I can follow up with some of our experts in our office and see if we can get you an answer or point you in the right direction. Since you're on Facebook, I could probably follow up and send you a direct message, I think. But if you want to be safe and just email us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov, we can start an email thread and try and get that answer for you. Um, and I don't see any other live questions as of now. Ginger, do you want to ask another one of the pre-submitted questions?
Let's see. One of the questions was, when did they stop using the mess halls and barracks and on-site housing, etc.?
Well, there's really two different camps. If for the World War II, the Hanford construction camp near the town of Hanford was pretty much a ghost town by February of 45. That was the camp that was built to construct everything on site. And, by January of 45, the F reactor, the last reactor is up and running. The construction work's done. Everything's wrapping up. And by April or May, there's couple articles in the regional newspapers about the ghost town of Hanford. And there's goats running through the streets. And it's like been returned to wilderness, which is really funny to say about a construction camp on the Hanford site when it's just undergoing, like when they're pumping out plutonium. But that's the kind of Wild West rhetoric that we get. But that was all. Those buildings started to be torn. They were vacant by mid 1945, began to be torn down afterwards. Now, if you go to the construction camp, there's nothing left but roads and sewage tanks. There was a North Richland construction camp, kind of where PNNL WC Tri-Cities is today. That was a camp that was built in the end of World War II, early Cold War, that ran until the late 40s, early 50s, where the John Ball School was. It housed several thousand people. It was mostly trailers, but it did have some other, was kind of its own little town into itself. And that camp existed until the early 50s. And that was for the people that did the Cold War expansion of Hanford, which was a massive expansion. I mean, more reactors were built in that period than there were initially. And so it really is, I mean, it's really the doubling down on this quest to produce plutonium. And kind of really gets overshadowed by the Manhattan Project, but it's the real legacy and a lot of what gives us what we're dealing with today, the waste.
Definitely. So I'm not seeing any more live questions yet. So if anybody, this will be our last call for any live questions on WebEx and Facebook. I know there's a bit of a lag on Facebook, so I guess to kind of make up for that last second lag, I can read some of the comments that weren't exactly questions, Robert, since you can't see the Facebook stream. But again, if anybody has any questions that they want asked, this is your last call for live questions. Feel free to definitely submit questions after the event, and we're happy to answer them too. But we had one comment, Robert, from Melissa O'Neill Purdue, who said, "This is really interesting and also historically shocking info. Proud of WSU Tri-Cities for continuing this project."
Thank you, Melissa.
And we had, I saw another one somewhere on here. I think, and then we had Hanford Challenge thanking us for putting on the event. Thank you, Hanford Challenge, and thanks for sharing our event as well.
Yep. Thanks for all the work that you guys do.
And we also had Damian Davis say Franklin County Historical Society is watching and great presentation.
Oh, well, thank you, Franklin County. Beautiful museum. If anybody hasn't been there when COVID opens up, that is just they do good work there. And we're also a source of information for a lot of stuff about East Pasco.
Definitely. And we had one more comment come in just saying this has been fascinating. Thank you. And that was from Deanna, who asked a question earlier. And I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but so Ginger, if you want to start closing us out, I think we're probably good for tonight.
Well, I thought it'd be fun. I am a Richland bomber, and I just wanted to point out that another interesting source of information is called the Alumni Sandstorm, and it's the Richland Bomber alumni blog, I guess, website and blog. And Robert mentioned the John Ball School. We actually got to go have lunch. They were still kids who went to the John Ball Elementary School, but were Richland Bombers, were still having lunch together as recently as like 5 or 6 years ago. They would meet twice a month. And it was interesting because they talked about the classism, because they were trailer trash. That's what they called themselves. And it was about 10 people, and I think all of them had degrees, including the women, and they had grown up in the 50s. So despite starting out as trailer trash, they were all quite accomplished people by the time they were in their 70s and 80s and meeting for lunch. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining us. And our next episode is actually going to be about Hanford Wildlife. I think it's scheduled for October 29th. Is it the 29th again? Or 29th?
I believe so. It's
October, sometime in October.
Yeah, either the 27th or the 28th, but we'll have an announcement coming out next week about it.
Sure. And this is recorded, so you can go find it later on our Ecology YouTube channel. And we hope that everybody had a great night, and thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Robert, again, for your great experience and for sharing with us. You're going to have to come up with another topic because we're going to want to see you again. So I don't know what's left, but there you go. Pick something to really dive into it or something.
I will when I finally make some headway on this Jim Acord nuclear sculpture project. We'll talk about nuclear art.
Okay, great.
Awesome. And Robert, besides that, do you have any kind of closing comments on maybe a combination of last presentation and this presentation, or any final thoughts before we close out?
I just want to thank everybody for showing up. I want to thank you guys at the Department of Ecology for being such wonderful co-presenters and setting all this up. It's been wonderful to get to know you and work with you. And yeah, I'm just been pleased as punch. And this is, at WSU, we're a land grant, and I take service, like public service, really seriously. And so this is a great way to be able to be that bridge between kind of what's in my archive and what people are interested in. So I appreciate everyone who came today and helped putting this together.
Thank you. All right, well, I guess that wraps it up. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you next time.